Shame. We all know what shame is, but sometimes we shame other people. We're talking about shame as a verb on this episode of the Driving with Rob podcast. We all know what shame is. Words associated with shame are embarrassment, humiliation, a feeling of regret, wishing that you had not done something, or wishing that you could have done something differently so you could have avoided the embarrassment and regret. But what I want to talk about today is shame as a verb. To shame. To make someone else feel ashamed. To use shame as a weapon. The older generation, and when I say older generation, I'm not really thinking about myself. I'm thinking about my parents' and grandparents' age. Were very good at pointing out things that you should be ashamed for. My grandmother, I remember my grandmother, this was just a phrase, just a part of speech that she used to use where she would say, "You ought to be ashamed. You ought to be ashamed of yourself." I have a radical friend who asked me one time if I'd ever been on Facebook suspension because I made some inflammatory comment or some political statement that got me banned or suspended from Facebook. And I said no. And he said, "You should be ashamed." Because he firmly believed if you're not fighting the system, you're part of the problem. That as good citizens, we owe it to society to speak out when we see something wrong. And he believed if you hadn't been suspended from Facebook yet, it's because you're complacent. You're part of the problem. And he thought it was a shame that I had never made a statement that was so inflammatory that it got me banned from Facebook. But my grandmother used to say if I did something, not necessarily bad, it was just something that she used to like to say, "You should be ashamed." But I think in this culture, in this social media driven culture that we live in now, that far too often we're trying to shame other people. That we're using shame as a weapon. That we're trying to cause other people to feel shame. That because of Twitter and Facebook, it's very, very easy to say horrible things about other people that you would never say to their face. But you can put it in a tweet or put it in a Facebook comment. And you feel like that somehow insulates you. That puts you above being criticized for criticizing others. But shame as a verb, to shame someone else, is one of the most horrible things one human being can do to another, or can say to another, or say about another. You know, there's fat shaming, trying to make somebody feel ashamed because they're overweight. Why would you want to do that to somebody? Any form of bullying is, for all intents and purposes, shaming. If you're taunting somebody or making fun of somebody, you're trying to shame them. You're trying to make them feel ashamed. And not necessarily feel ashamed for anything they've done, so much as to just make them feel shame in general. And for many, many years, the Christians were masters at shaming other people. And felt fully justified in shaming somebody because the Bible clearly says ... Because not so awfully many years ago, the United States was a predominantly Christian country. It still is, but not as predominantly Christian as it used to be. So if you wanted to make somebody feel ashamed of something they did or a lifestyle that they were living, all you had to do was quote the Bible. And pretty much no matter who you wanted to attack, if you wanted to make somebody feel ashamed, you could find a passage of Scripture that would back you up on it. And Christians especially became very adept at shaming people But in recent years, there's kind of been a cultural shift. The best way to shame somebody now is to accuse them of some form of discrimination, some form of intolerance. Like I said earlier about being banned from Facebook for inflammatory political statements. If you're not for us, you're against us. If you don't believe what I believe, you're wrong, and I'm going to shame you publicly on Facebook. Because the most shameful thing you can do now is to be intolerant. The current culture believes everything is acceptable and should be accepted. And just the bare fact that you're willing to say anything is wrong, as far as lifestyle and personal choices, you're a bigot, you're a racist, you're a sexist, and I'm going to try to shame you for it. But that makes you just as guilty of trying to shame other people as the people you're criticizing. And the reason we're here, the reason we're on this planet, is so that we can help each other and promote each other and encourage each other to live the best life that we can in spite of everything we've been through and everything we're going through. And shaming others or trying to make others feel shame is completely opposite of encouragement. When you shame somebody else or you try to cause somebody to feel ashamed, you're tearing them down. You're not building them up. And some people will try to justify shaming someone else as, I was defending this other person. And somehow, some way, you decided that the best way to defend that person is to bully or shame the other person. Shame as a verb is a very powerful weapon. You can destroy somebody's self-confidence, destroy their self-esteem. People have committed suicide over shame. So think about this when you're trying to criticize or minimize someone else. There's a difference between having a disagreement with somebody and trying to shame somebody. Jesus said to love your neighbor as yourself. And who is my neighbor? Your neighbor is everybody else on the planet who's not you. And if you truly love somebody, you would never try to shame them. You would never try to humiliate them. You would never try to embarrass them. You would never try to make them feel shame. So whenever you feel yourself criticizing somebody, think about this. Are you criticizing because you disagree? Or are you just trying to shame somebody? And shaming as a verb is wrong. It's always wrong, it always has been, and it always will be. Don't shame other people, because you wouldn't want them shaming you. And that's going to do it for this episode of the podcast. I appreciate you listening. Thanks for listening. Thanks for downloading. And I'll talk to you next time. Bye now.